there is a truth no one will say to your face. The world does not reward the man who absorbs pain quietly. It does not celebrate the one who swallows betrayal and calls it maturity. It does not hand power to the man who opens his arms to the same people who drove knives into his back and smiled while doing it. The world watches, and what it sees in the man who forgives too freely is not nobility. It sees a target. It sees a man who can be broken, reset, and broken again. And the moment that signal goes out, it never stops broadcasting. You were not born to be a landing pad for other people's cruelty. You were not placed on this earth to absorb damage and call it character. The men who told you that forgiveness was the highest form of strength were men who needed you compliant. They needed you accessible. They needed you to remain in a posture of openness so that the cycle could continue, so the wound could be reopened on schedule, so your energy could be redirected into managing their consequences instead of building your own empire. Machiavelli did not write for the gentle. He wrote for the clear-eyed. He wrote for the man willing to look at human nature without flinching, without dressing it in sentiment, without pretending that warmth and loyalty operate by the rules of fairness. He understood something that takes most men decades of bleeding to learn. That power does not flow toward the forgiving. Power flows toward the builder, the architect, the man who takes every scar and every silence and every dismissal and converts it with cold precision into something the world was not prepared for. The men who wronged you were not accidents. They were not confused. They were not going through something difficult that caused them momentarily to lose their way. They ran a calculation. They looked at what you were offering, and they made a decision, a quiet, deliberate, self-serving decision that your openness was an opportunity, that your loyalty was a resource to be extracted, that your trust was an unlocked door they could walk through and back out of without consequence. And they were right. Because you let them be right, because you were operating under a framework designed to protect them, a framework sold to you as spiritual elevation, dressed in the language of inner peace and emotional freedom, but built, brick by brick, to ensure that people who cause harm never face the architecture of consequence. That ends here. Not with rage, not with obsession, not with the kind of bitterness that curls inward and poisons everything it touches. It ends with clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when a man finally stops arguing with reality and starts using it as raw material. Because what they did to you, the betrayal, the dismissal, the quiet undermining while your back was turned, that was not the end of your story. That was the first sentence of the version that matters. Machiavelli's prince was never the most beloved figure in the room. He was the most prepared. He was the one who had studied human nature long enough to stop being surprised by it, who had stripped away every romantic illusion about loyalty and replaced it with something infinitely more valuable, a map. A precise, unsentimentalized map of how people actually move, what they actually protect, what they will actually sacrifice you for when the numbers shift in their favor. And with that map, the prince did not become paranoid. He became strategic. He stopped giving access indiscriminately and started treating proximity as a resource to be distributed with intention. This is not cynicism. Cynicism is the response of a man who expected the world to be fair and collapsed when it wasn't. What I am describing is something different. It is the posture of a man who has looked at the full picture, accepted it without illusion, and decided to operate from a position of knowledge rather than a position of hope. Hope is not a strategy. Hope is what you had before the lesson. Knowledge is what you carry after. Every man who has been truly betrayed arrives at a crossroads. Not in a dramatic moment, not with music building in the background, not with the cinematic clarity that stories promise. It arrives quietly, usually in the middle of the night, usually when the noise has finally stopped, and all that remains is the weight of what happened and the question of what comes next. And in that silence, the direction a man chooses determines everything, not just about what he builds next, about who he becomes, about how thick the walls are on the next structure, about how carefully the foundation is laid, about how precisely he vets every person who has ever allowed close to something he has built. The men who let that crossroads break them are everywhere. You can see it in the way they talk about their past, always circling back, always narrating from the wound, always defining themselves by what was done to them rather than what they constructed from the wreckage. They became curators of their own suffering, and suffering, when curated, never transforms, it just accumulates. But there is another kind of man, the kind who gets very still after the wound, who goes quiet in a way that makes people around him slightly uncomfortable, as if they can sense that something is being reorganized internally, something is being rebuilt on a blueprint they will not be given access to. This man does not announce his reconstruction. He does not post about his journey. He does not seek validation from the same world that failed to protect him. He simply begins. In the dark, in the private hours, with the ferocity of someone who has finally run out of time to waste on anything that does not compound into power. Machiavelli understood that the prince who telegraphed his wounds invited further attack. The prince who showed the world he could be hurt again was the prince who would be. But the prince who went silent, who redirected every ounce of energy inward, who stopped performing vulnerability for an audience that would use it as ammunition, that prince became something the room could not read. And a man who cannot be read cannot be played. And a man who cannot be played cannot be stopped. This is the first principle. Not forgiveness, not peace, not the closure that self-help books promise you can purchase at the cost of your standards. The first principle is invisibility of reconstruction. The first principle is going so deep into the work that the people who underestimated you run out of narrative, because they built their story about you on the version that accepted their treatment. And when that version no longer exists, when you have rebuilt so far beyond that moment that the wound is now the foundation rather than the ceiling, the story they told about you collapses under the weight of what you became. That is not revenge. Revenge is amateur. Revenge is a man still emotionally leashed to the moment of injury, still orbiting the person who caused it, still giving them the power of being the protagonist in a story that should belong entirely to him. What I am describing is elevation, so total, so deliberate, so architecturally sound that the distance between where you were and where you are becomes the answer to everything they ever said about you. No confrontation required, no explanation owed. The silence at the top communicates everything that the wound at the bottom never could. Let's talk about what forgiveness actually costs you. Not in the spiritual sense, not in the abstract language of karma and cosmic balance that has been used for centuries to keep wounded men docile and available. In the practical, architectural, power-building sense, what does it actually cost a man when he forgives someone who has not changed, who has not paid a price, who has not even acknowledged the damage they caused, and who will, given the same circumstances and the same calculation, do the exact same thing again? It costs him his signal. The signal that his boundaries are real. The signal that access to him carries weight and consequence. The signal that what he builds, what he protects, what he values, is not available to anyone who smiles warmly enough or constructs a convincing enough story about why they deserve another chance. The moment a man forgives without evidence of transformation, he doesn't just let one person back through the door. He sends a broadcast to everyone watching. And people are always watching. They watch how you handle betrayal. They watch whether the line you drew held. They watch whether your standards are architecture or decoration. And when they see the door swing open again for someone who never earned it, they update their model of you. They file away the information. They note that the consequences you imply are negotiable. And negotiable consequences are no consequences at all. Machiavelli was not writing a manual for cruelty. He was writing a manual for survival in a world that does not reward sentiment. He watched princes fall not because they were too harsh, but because they were inconsistent. Because they drew lines and then erased them. Because they made examples and then pardoned them. Because they allowed warmth to override strategy at exactly the moments when strategy was most critical. And in those moments of softness, those moments where mercy was performed for an audience rather than deployed for advantage, the prince lost not just the battle in front of him, he lost the perception of strength that kept every other battle from arriving. Perception is not vanity. Perception is infrastructure. How the world reads you determines how the world approaches you. A man who is perceived as someone whose pain is temporary, whose anger dissolves under the right pressure, whose standards bend when pushed firmly enough, that man will be pushed, constantly, by everyone, because the cost of testing him is low. And in a world where people are constantly running calculations about what they can extract and what it will cost, a man with a low testing cost is a man who will spend his entire life managing incursions instead of building empires. The strong man does not forgive freely because he understands this arithmetic. He understands that every time he absorbs damage without consequence, he is subsidizing the next attack. He is lowering the price of his own destruction. He is, in the most practical sense, funding the behavior that will eventually undo him if left unchecked. And so he makes a different choice. Not hatred. Hatred is too expensive. It requires too much attention, too much energy, too much ongoing investment in the person who caused the wound. The strong man's choice is colder than hatred and more permanent. It is removal. It is the quiet, total withdrawal of access. It is the decision that this person has already received more of his energy than they deserved, and that not one additional unit will be allocated to managing the relationship, processing the damage, or performing the forgiveness ritual that benefits everyone except him. This is where most men struggle, because removal feels like anger, because the culture has taught us that cutting people off is a sign of emotional immaturity, that the evolved response is to process, to communicate, to extend grace, to hold space for the complexity of the other person's experience. And there are contexts where that framework serves you. There are relationships and situations where the capacity to metabolize conflict and remain connected is genuinely the higher skill. But that framework was not designed for betrayal. It was not designed for the person who looked at your trust and made a strategic decision to exploit it. Applying a framework built for misunderstanding to a situation built on calculation is not wisdom. It is confusion. And confusion, when sustained long enough, becomes a personality. The man of power separates these categories with surgical precision. He knows the difference between someone who hurt him because they were broken and someone who hurt him because they decided to. He knows the difference between a relationship worth metabolizing and one worth cauterizing. And he makes those distinctions not based on how much the person meant to him at the time, not based on the history they share, not based on the discomfort of the alternative, but based on one question only. Does this person, in their current form, without any assumed transformation, represent a resource or a liability to the architecture I am building? If the answer is liability, the conversation is already over. The only remaining question is how cleanly the removal is executed. Because clean removal is its own form of power. The man who removes quietly, without drama, without the need for a final confrontation or a witnessed exit, that man signals something important. He signals that his peace is not negotiable, that his standards do not require external validation, that he does not need the satisfaction of being understood by the person who never truly understood him to begin with. He simply recalibrates and advances. And in that advance, in that relentless forward movement that does not pause to look back at what it left behind, is the truest expression of strength that a man can demonstrate. Now understand what rebuilding actually demands of you, because this is where romantic ideas about transformation go to die, replaced by something far more demanding and far more real. Rebuilding is not a feeling. It is not the surge of motivation that arrives after a powerful piece of content or a moment of clarity at 2 a.m. Motivation is weather. It changes. It is tied to emotion, and emotion is the least reliable foundation a man can build on. What rebuilding requires is something colder, something more structural, something that operates independently of how you feel on any given day, because on most days during genuine reconstruction, you will not feel inspired. You will feel exhausted. You will feel the specific heaviness of a man carrying the weight of what he is trying to become before that becoming has produced any visible results. Machiavelli wrote that the new order is difficult to establish because those who benefited from the old order will resist it, while those who would benefit from the new order offer only lukewarm support until they see results. He was writing about political power, but the principle applies with equal force to the internal architecture of a man rebuilding himself. The old version of you, the one that was accessible, that was forgiving, that was available to be used, that version had its beneficiaries. And when you begin to change, when you begin to tighten the perimeter, when you begin redirecting energy from managing other people's perception of you to building something real, you will face resistance. Not always external, often internal. The old patterns will argue for themselves. The old softness will present itself as virtue. The old access you gave to undeserving people will dress itself up as loyalty or depth or emotional intelligence. And you will have to override it, not once, repeatedly, every day, in the small decisions, in the moments no one is watching, in the hours where the only accountability is to the blueprint you laid down for yourself. This is why most men never complete the rebuild, not because they lack ability, not because the damage was too severe, but because the process demands a level of self-governance that is entirely unsupported by the environment around them. The culture does not applaud the man who goes quiet and builds. It applauds the man who performs his healing publicly, who shares the journey, who packages his growth into content that can be consumed and validated. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. But for the man engaged in genuine architectural reconstruction, public performance is a leak. Every unit of energy spent performing the process is a unit of energy not invested in the process itself. And the man who is serious about what he is building guards his energy the way a general guards supply lines. Because without the supply, the campaign ends before the objective is reached, so he disappears, in a sense. Not literally. He remains in the world, does his work, handles his obligations, but internally, in the place where the real construction is happening, he is unreachable, not because he is closed, but because he is occupied. Fully, relentlessly occupied with the work of becoming something that the situation which broke him never anticipated. And that occupation is not a burden. In the hands of the man who has chosen it clearly, it is the most powerful state a human being can inhabit. It is the state where pain stops being something that happened to you and starts being the most potent fuel source you have ever had access to. The men who came before you and built things that lasted did not build them in comfort. They built them in the aftermath, in the wreckage, in the period after the collapse that most people use to mourn and a rare few used to engineer. They took the full inventory of what had been lost, what had been stolen, what had been underestimated, and they converted every single item on that list into motivation so precise and so cold that it functioned not like fire, but like architecture. Not burning everything in its path, but constructing something so solid that nothing from the past could reach it anymore. There is a specific kind of man the world never sees coming, not because he is hiding, but because while everyone else was watching the loud ones, the ones performing their ambition, announcing their moves, seeking validation at every stage of their climb, this man was somewhere quiet, doing something no one was paying attention to. He was building, not for the audience, not for the approval, not even for the satisfaction of being recognized. He was building because he had reached the point where building was the only response left that made any sense. Every other option had been stripped away by circumstance, by betrayal, by the slow accumulated weight of being underestimated by people who should have known better. And what remained after all of that stripping was not emptiness, it was clarity. The most dangerous kind of clarity a man can possess, the kind that does not need to explain itself. Machiavelli understood that the most formidable forces in the world are not the loudest ones. The prince who declares his strength constantly is the prince who is performing for people he privately fears. Real strength does not require an audience. It does not require acknowledgement from the people it surpassed. It does not need the closure of a witnessed victory. It simply advances. Quietly, technically, with the kind of precision that only becomes visible long after the distance has already been created. And by the time the people who underestimated that man finally understand what happened, the gap is irreversible. The architecture is complete. The foundation is poured and hardened, and they are standing at the base of something they will never be invited inside. That is what you are building toward, not a moment of confrontation, not a scene where you stand over the people who doubted you and deliver the line you rehearsed in the dark. That fantasy belongs to the man who is still emotionally tethered to the wound. The man who has truly rebuilt does not need that scene. He does not even think about it often. Because the work consumed him so completely, because the construction demanded so much of his attention and his discipline and his private hours, that the people who caused the pain became progressively smaller in his field of vision, not because he forgave them, but because they became irrelevant. And irrelevance is a more complete erasure than any confrontation could ever produce. This is the psychology that Machiavelli never made sentimental. He wrote about power with the detachment of a man who had watched enough cycles of rise and fall to understand that the emotional response to injury is almost always the wrong strategic response. Rage makes you readable. Grief makes you stagnant. Even justified anger, the kind that feels like fuel, burns too hot and too fast to sustain the kind of long arc construction that actually changes a man's position in the world. What sustains that construction is something quieter. A decision. A cold, non-negotiable, revisited every morning decision that the version of you that absorbed that treatment is being permanently retired. That the new architecture being built on its foundation will operate by different rules, rules you set, enforced by your consistency, validated not by anyone's approval, but by the compound results of applying them without exception over time. Because time is the variable that most men misunderstand when they begin to rebuild. They expect the results to be proportional to the intensity of the effort. They push hard for a period, and they look for evidence that the gap is closing, that the work is translating, that the sacrifice is producing visible returns. And when the evidence is slow to arrive, which it always is in the early stages of genuine reconstruction, they question the process. They wonder if they are doing it right. They look sideways at men who seem to be advancing faster, and they recalibrate their self-assessment based on a comparison that was never valid to begin with. And in that recalibration, in that momentary loss of faith in the architecture, they introduce the first crack. The man who rebuilds successfully does not measure progress in the short intervals. He has made peace with the fact that the compound nature of real development is invisible for long stretches of time, that the work he is doing today will not produce legible results for months, sometimes years, that the discipline he is imposing on himself in the private hours is being stored, not spent, accumulating in a ledger that the world cannot yet read, but that will eventually become undeniable. He operates on a different time horizon than the people around him. And that temporal detachment, that willingness to trust the process across a span that most people's patience cannot cover, is itself one of the most powerful competitive advantages a man can develop. Machiavelli wrote that men should either be caressed or crushed, because they will seek revenge for small injuries, but cannot do so for great ones. This is a truth about human nature that operates in both directions. It applies to how you treat your enemies. And it applies to how you treat yourself. The small betrayals of your own standards, the minor concessions you make to comfort, the small forgivenesses you extend to your own avoidance, those are the injuries that accumulate and undermine the architecture. Because you can rebuild from a great collapse. The psychology of surviving catastrophe is well documented. It strips away everything non-essential and leaves a core that can serve as a foundation. But the slow erosion of small compromises, the daily decision to let the standard slip just slightly, to give access just once more, to tolerate just this one exception, that erosion is invisible until the structure fails. And when it fails from that kind of rot, a man often cannot identify the cause because no single decision was dramatic enough to point to. This is why the standard must be architectural, not situational. It cannot be a guideline you apply when convenient and suspend when uncomfortable. It must be load-bearing. It must be the thing the entire structure rests on. And load-bearing elements are not negotiable. They are not adjusted based on mood or circumstance or the persuasive pressure of someone who benefits from your softness. They hold. They hold because if they do not hold, everything above them collapses. And a man who has already survived one collapse and done the brutal work of rebuilding from it cannot afford to learn that lesson twice. Now let us address the people watching your rebuild, because there will be people watching. Some of them will be curious, some of them will be genuinely supportive, and those people deserve to be recognized and kept close, because a man building in isolation makes slower progress than a man who has cultivated a small circle of genuinely aligned individuals who have proven themselves through consistency rather than proximity. But many of the people watching your rebuild will be something else entirely. They will be the people who benefited from the previous version of you, the version that was available, the version that absorbed without limit, the version that mistook access for affection and tolerance for loyalty, and they will watch your transformation with a specific kind of discomfort that they will dress up as concern. They will tell you that you have changed,